Good evening, everybody. I'm Selena Anderson, Director of the Center for Literary Arts, and on behalf of the board and staff, I'm pleased to welcome you to tonight's reading with author Tommy Orange. This event is made possible thanks to the generous support of the Martha Heasley Cox Lecture, the Joyce Milligan Family Foundation, and the College of Humanities and the Arts Artistic Excellence Programming Grant. During the season of readings, the Center for Literary Arts is pleased to present some of the most innovative and exciting writers of contemporary American literature. Speakers include Lauren Groff, Carvel Wallace, Natalie Diaz, Ted Chiang, and many others. All of our events take place here at the Hammer Theater on Thursday nights at 6:30 p.m., and they are all free and open to the public. For more information, visit our website at clasanjose.org. Okay, our program will run as follows. In just a moment, the author will read from his latest work, after which he'll be interviewed by Dr. Carrie Malloy, Professor of Native American Indigenous Studies and Director of the Ethnic Studies Collaborative. After the interview, we'll take a few questions from the audience, and at the end of the program, pre-signed copies of Wandering Stars and They're There will be available for purchase, courtesy of Spartan Bookstore. A masterful follow-up to his already classic first novel, Wandering Stars extends the author's constellation of narratives into the past and future, tracing the legacies of the Sand Creek Massacre of 1864 and the Carlisle Indian Industrial School through 3 generations of a family in a story that is, by turns, shattering and wondrous. Wandering Stars is a novel of epigenetic and generational trauma that has the force and vision of a modern epic, an exceptionally powerful new book from one of the most exciting writers at work today, and a soaring confirmation of Tommy Orange's monumental gifts. Tommy Orange is a graduate of the MFA program at the Institute of American Indian Arts, an enrolled member of the Cheyenne and Arapaho tribes of Oklahoma. He was born and raised in Oakland, California. His first book, There, was a finalist for the 2019 Pulitzer Prize and received the 2019 American Book Award. He lives in Oakland, California. Please join me in welcoming Tommy Orange.
Thank you, Selena. Thank you all for coming out. I was telling Selena earlier, people don't often want to hear me read from the book. And I'm like, that's the thing that I worked on for 6 years. And this, just me talking, is not good. So I'm going to read a part from the second half of the book. The book is broken up into before and aftermath. It's a structure that's sort of based on something that happens in the first part of the book, where first with prisoners of war at a prison castle called Fort Marion, they took before and after pictures to kind of show that you could kill the Indian to save the man, essentially. That was the slogan. And then they did it to the kids at Carlisle School and countless other boarding schools for like 100 years, but sort of to first sell the idea that they should do what they did to the adult prisoners of war to all the children. They took these pictures and like published them in the newspaper to cut off their hair and made them wear military uniforms. But what I'm going to read is sort of more, it's been called a prequel sequel, and compared to Godfather 2, I guess that's what happens in that movie. So this is following Orville, a character from There, in sort of what happens to him after being shot at a powwow. Can you all hear me okay? The only thing alive. A bad thing doesn't stop happening to you just because it stops happening to you. In therapy, this is called trauma. Opal had me doing therapy twice a week, individual and group, to make sure I had the help I needed it if I needed it. That was how Opal put it to me, and that I had to go. Opal was over careful about not saying that I needed therapy. Of course I needed it. It was more like I had to go, like the way I always had to go to school and had to get good grades. Go, get. Don't give anyone an excuse to leave you behind. to not see you, to forget you're there. Opal averaged 10 miles a day on her mail route, so if anyone knew about not getting left behind, it was her. We would not let what happened be the reason I get behind in school, even though school hadn't even started yet. Opal said we would rise above what happened because bad things happening to you were opportunities, ways to find out who you were, find out what else couldn't keep you down, and were the only way you could find out how strong you were. Opal got too positive after the powwow. It wasn't like her. She'd always been so real. Positive thinking sounds stupid, but I get it. I just hated that what happened had changed her, had changed everything. Hated it so much some days I wished the bullet had killed me. So I needed therapy. Obviously, I needed therapy. I'd gotten shot while I was dancing. But there was more I should have been to therapy about before. My whole childhood with my mom before she died. Nobody wants to be told they need therapy, just like nobody wants to be told they got problems. Paid therapy felt better to me than some kind of free or court-mandated kind. Plus, the therapist was supposedly native. Opal had found him on the internet. He said his grandmother was a full-blooded Arapaho. He looked white to me, and then sometimes not. Sometimes he seemed hella Indian, like in what he said and the way he said it. Like how what Opal said could sometimes seem to come from a long time ago, and you just knew it was some hard-won wisdom passed down to her, something simple and timeless that you could actually use in your life. I'd heard the word trauma before. Everyone knows the word trauma. But when I heard it used about me, I didn't like it. All of the work we'll be doing together will be related to your trauma response, Dr. Hoffman had said in our first session. The 4 F's, he said. There are 4 kinds of trauma responses, 2 of which you've probably heard of, fight and flight. But the other 2 lesser-known responses are freeze and fawn. Fawn, isn't that like a deer, I said. And a yawn escaped Dr. Hoffman's mouth, which he visibly tried to suppress by putting his fist to his nose and sort of squeezing his face like it was a fist, after which he didn't fully yawn, but did that yawn version of throwing up in your mouth. It has to do with taking care of other people's feelings and putting their feelings before your own. We will address all forms of trauma response in our healing work. I didn't think healing and work belonged together like home and work didn't. And it felt like homework thinking about doing healing work. But the healing work just ended up being art therapy, like drawing and painting and drumming and writing, learning to reframe my story with writing. Dr. Hoffman wanted me to write what he was calling an autobiography, which I told him I didn't want to write. We did physical stuff too, meant to express and exercise my pain and emotions. Once we did a walking meditation around Lake Merritt. It felt like it took forever. Another time we went up to the hills and shot an arrow with a bow at some paper targets taped to a redwood. Calling it archery in the end wasn't enough to make it feel okay to be native and shooting a bow and arrow in the woods for therapy. But I had to admit it was kind of fun, and I wanted to be good at shooting the bow and arrow, as if it were some test I needed to pass. As if I should just know how, like that knowledge should be in my DNA. The craziest thing we did was called reverse speech therapy. Dr. Hoffman recorded me saying stuff in our sessions, then processed it with something he called backmasking, which was just playing it in reverse from what I could tell. Dr. Hoffman said the backmasked version was my unconscious speaking in reverse simultaneously as I consciously said things forward. You're saying, wait, so what are you saying? I asked. And Dr. Hoffman laughed, then coughed a cough that seemed caused by the laughter. You're saying whatever I say, some other part of me is saying another thing, but it can only be heard if I listen to it backward. Your unconscious is a powerful, powerful part of you, Dr. Hoffman said. I didn't like how he'd said powerful twice in a row like that, but also felt like Dr. Hoffman's unconscious was what was behind him having said it twice in a row. All humans have this ability, Dr. Hoffman cleared his throat, then pointed at his throat, saying, double speaking is natural for our vocal cords and true to the dual nature of reality. Think of all the ways the world is split in two. Night and day, sleeping and waking, life and death, good and evil, noise and silence, darkness and light. As he spoke and repeated these opposites to illustrate his point, he kept flipping his palm so it faced up and then down. The unconscious way of speaking is closer to poetry, and the conscious one is closer to prose. Yeah, but that's like saying everybody has some split personality. If we don't acknowledge the unconscious, which is what it wants, then we allow it to run the show, as in dreams or worse, nightmares, and we never wake up to who we are as a whole. Are you talking about being woke? I said, trying to be funny. I'm talking about seeing the mind as being more than what we think we know it to be. One recorded clip had me saying, I really don't think I'm doing that bad, and then backward or back masked, it sounded like gonna nod, might nod, delirious. I didn't think it meant anything, but later, way later, something I couldn't even see the start of then, when I was actually nodding out from too many pills, that phrase ended up messing with me. Like, did some part of me somehow know what was coming? Group therapy was just talking circles with other kids who I thought probably had to be there like they were court mandated. At least that's what their faces said. Like, when's this shit gonna be over? But then maybe my face said that too. In group sessions, Dr. Hoffman would always do most of the talking before anyone else to explain why the talking mattered in talking circles. Like everyone could just kumbaya their way back from trauma. It's important to voice things, to sound them out, like the way we learn to spell by slowly saying words. We have to sound out our stories, and they may come out slow and clumsy, and we may misspell them, so to speak, at first, when we first go to try, which is to say we may misunderstand them. But as we frame and reframe them, our own stories, the ones we tell each other and tell ourselves about what happened to us and what it means in the context of our lives, and the bigger life we're a part of, the better we can understand what it all means. The more sure and purposeful our steps forward will become, and the more informed our decisions will be. It's just as important for you to hear yourself speak your stories as it is for others to hear you speak them, so that you can come to know you're not alone, and more the same as the person sitting next to you than you are different from them, which you never would have believed unless they opened their mouths to share their stories here in these circles. One thing I want you to understand is that your suffering does not make you special. There's a voice inside everyone who suffers that says no one else has it like this. And so much selfish action comes from listening to that voice. You are not alone, you are not special, and there is help. We have one another. Dr. Hoffman called me out on saying shit was kumbaya in one of our individual counseling sessions. I didn't even know where I got the kumbaya thing from. Probably a meme. I'd complained that native things can feel corny and fake, or like trying too hard for something that wasn't really there, that the shit was kumbaya. Dr. Hoffman told me that the word kumbaya was originally an African-American spiritual, a song that was also a prayer asking for divine intervention, asking for help in dire times, and that then the hippies in the 60s took it and sang it to mean unity amid protest, and then it got played out and became a stand-in for corniness about togetherness. Corniness about togetherness, I said back. But there's nothing corny about asking your higher power for help when you need it most, he said. Or do you think that's corny too? Are you asking me for real? Let's just agree that I won't ever be asking you anything in a not real way in our sessions, okay? Yeah, I think the higher power thing is corny, and the talking circle is corny, and crying out for help when you need it most, if I'm being honest, feels kind of corny too. Like, who's really going to help you when you need it most? God? Like some great big being who made everything's going to come around to help some little human life? Like one of our little lives matter? Because what about all the good people who die every day crying out for God and God doing nothing for them? What, they don't deserve it? I appreciate your honesty, Orville. How you feel about these things is real, like you said, and everything can be useful, even corniness. Dr. Hoffman called his approach to trauma and healing using all of the buffalo, which was also super corny. Your feeling that something is corny has to do with trust. You not believing people are being authentic, which probably meant for you they were lying to get their way, in other words, manipulating you. So when you see or hear corniness, you're just responding to a very real and valid feeling you have around trust. He was always looking behind me after asking questions or making statements. There wasn't anything there but a wall, so I guess that was him demonstrating that he was thinking, taking me and my problems seriously. When we start to understand how much of our behavior has to do with trauma response, Dr. Hoffman started saying, but I checked out. looking over his shoulder. Behind him was a window where sometimes a red-headed little bird landed on the sill and looked in on us. Sometimes I thought the bird was imaginary. And when I did, the bird seemed to take on more fantastic qualities, like turning its head to the side, like it was putting its ear up to the window. And sometimes I imagined the bird crashing into the window with a thud and dying in the middle of one of our sessions there below the window pane, dead on the ledge, dead eyes wide open, still looking in on us. When I first woke up in the hospital, my brothers were sitting at the foot of my bed, playing war with a beat-up deck of cards. Our grandma Jackie watched Luther and Lonnie play, sneaking looks at me every now and then. I snuck looks too. And through a squint, I watched a pigeon with one foot land on a ledge outside the window and felt bad for its plight, then remembered it could fly, and that feet don't matter so much when you can fly. Feet are more like a butt when you can fly. A slow tear ran down my cheek then. It would have been enough to feel the tear, its slow falling speed, its warmth, and to see my brothers there, to know Jackie, our real grandma, who'd never really been in our lives. It would be enough to make me want to cry, but the tear was just one of those waking up tears, like the wet on the grass in the morning isn't from rain. Lonnie was the first to notice I was awake, and when he did, he came over to hug me as best he could over the metal-barred bed rail. I went to speak, but then coughed and cleared my throat, then asked about where Opal was. Lonnie said she was getting us food, while Luther gathered up the playing cards at the end of the bed and put them back in the box. War, Luther said about the cards. The word war sounded loud in my head, like a metal box with nails in it going down a stairwell made of metal walls. Hospital cafeteria tacos, Lonnie said with his tongue out. Hope you're hungry, Luther said with a crooked Luther smile. I didn't ever want to eat again. I was that kind of not hungry. Jackie seemed like she was about to say something, and she covered one of her eyes with a fist, stood up and walked out into the hallway. I said to my brothers, so you guys just been playing cards while I was over here dying or what? They smiled wide and lost it for a second, laughed like nothing bad had ever happened to anyone. Laughing could really do that, make you forget. Then it hurt my stomach to laugh, and I winced and sucked in air through my teeth. We stopped laughing and watched the door to see if Jackie would come back in. I asked my brothers what Jackie was doing there once it seemed like she wasn't coming back in. Luther said he didn't know, and Lonnie said, yeah, we do. So I asked Luther what Lonnie was talking about. Lonnie said Jackie had carried me off the field after I got shot. One of your shoes fell off, Lonnie said. What are you talking about, I asked. Luther and Lonnie didn't know how to answer that, so silence hung there between us for a minute or so, like distant church bells, before Luther couldn't help but telling me again that Jackie had carried me, that I lost a shoe, motioning with his arms how she'd carried me out to the car to take me to the hospital. Lonnie put his arms up the same way as Luther's, indicating he saw her carry me out to the parking lot of the Coliseum too. They were telling me not to ask again why Jackie was there with their arms up like that. I felt shame about almost dying then, thought that it made me weak, which made me feel mad about the shame, but then too weak to hold the feeling. Lonnie stretched and farted pretty loud, which didn't seem on purpose. No one laughed because it didn't seem meant to be funny. He just stretched and accidentally let one out. There was a long pause before Lonnie said, do you know they go 10 feet per second? What? Luther said. No, they don't. You're hella stupid, Luther said. No, they don't. That's almost 7 miles per hour, Lonnie said, and looked at us both without even smiling. That did smell pretty fast, Luther said. And Lonnie laughed, that hard but quiet Lonnie laugh with little clicks that came from the back of his throat. I laughed out the word stupid, then felt that sharp ache in my gut again. But this time I didn't wince, just stayed laughing so as not to ruin the moment. This is the thing. You don't know what will happen to you. Everything is one way and you think you know what that means, and then one day you come to find out that no, this is what life is like anymore. For me, one day I was learning how to dance powwow from YouTube in my room, and the next I was shot down at a powwow on a baseball field in a coliseum. Life must be sweet like a bird waking you up in the morning with a song, and then it's that one under the window with its neck broke because it could have swore there just had to be more sky there. I heard most people ran when they heard the shots. I thought it was thunder. I thought the dancing might have brought the rain. I knew the rain dancing thing was stupid, and on the playground when I was younger, I'd even made some rain dancing jokes to make kids laugh, maybe even danced a little fake Indian dance and whooped while patting my mouth, but there was no rain the day of the powwow, and the only thing wet was my hand when I pulled it away from where the bullet quietly made its way into me. It didn't even hurt at first. It landed hard, but it was like this big muted thud, like a knock at someone else's door. Then it hurt so bad I left. I was out. I went wherever you go when you don't die but can't stay awake and you're not sleeping. It wasn't not like a dream. All my time after that in the hospital, then all my time after the hospital back home, plus the time back at the hospital again for my second surgery. Morphine was a trap. The thing brought dreams over into waking and waking things back over into dreams where you didn't know what was what. But it flew away the pain, too. I had what seemed an unlimited prescription of the almighty hydromorphone. Even the sound of the name of the pill felt like its strength, like some water monster, or like some kind of supernatural disaster. I'd looked the pill up and seen the brand name was Dilaudid, and one of the street names for it was Dilaudid. I liked that name for it because it made me feel weightless, like that crazy slow speed dust floated at when you saw it in a ray of light coming through a window. Hydromorphone beat morphine by a mile, that was for sure. All that same lift without the drift into dreams you didn't know were dreams. Nightmares were another thing. My grandma said I have an overactive imagination, like her compliment about too much activity in my brain helped in any way from stopping the horrible shit I dreamed about. But after what happened at the powwow, everything that came to me at night was some version of the day I got shot, and worse than that. Sometimes I woke up in a panic that seemed like it might last forever, like a scream I couldn't stop hearing, or like death coming on in a smothering rush. Sometimes the dreams were just about aggressive insects that reminded me of bullets, if bullets could be said to be hungry. The fear of sleep and the panic that seemed to grip me no matter what I did was why I came to feel I needed the hydromorphone. There was nothing more to it than that. I'd been broken, but I'd been broken open. The bullet had made its hole, a hole I felt stayed open even though it had been sewn shut. And the hole felt open, and like something was coming through, out of it, asking something of me in return, like it needed to be filled. And here were these pills. Thank you.
We okay? Can you hear me? All right.
Is mine on?
We could just have a conversation, forget they're here. It'd be good. I've struggled most of the day trying to figure out how I was going to start this. And it's because I struggled reading this book because I couldn't figure out where reality ended and fiction began. There is so much in here that is the day-to-day life experience of what it is to be an American Indian in this country. That to see where that breaks and moves into fiction is very difficult. But listening to you read this, something that came out in your words and then from reading this is, that's our life. That's the life we've lived, that's the life our parents lived, that's the life our grandparents lived. How do you sit down and take that reality and put it in a way that communicates what our life is like to non-Native people? How do you do that process? Because that's a struggle for a lot of us.
Thank you. That was the question started off rough.
Well, that was a plan. There's a plan here.
I think there's a real hunger that I think a lot of Native people feel
to depict ourselves in a way that is communicable. And we've grown up with so much false representation that it makes you really want to get it right, like what it's like. And it makes you want to communicate that we are human too, because the message has been we're less than human, we're subhuman. You know, Indian is sort of this stand-in for just like other non-Westerner, savage, barbarian. It's a story that's been going on in the Western mind all the way back to the Romans and the Greeks. And, you know, the original word for barbarians comes from the Greek for like people that don't speak Greek sound like bar, bar, bar. And it got turned into, you know, this idea of civilization versus wildness. And our story has been stuck being told this one way, and it's taken away our humanity in a major way. So my approach to fiction has this urgency of like trying to communicate in a clear way to the reader, like this is what we're like, that's accurate to Native people when they read it, but like is communicating that you can relate to this because we're all human, but we haven't been allowed that because of the false depiction of us over more than a century of depiction of us.
In the opening part of the book, as the Sand Creek Massacre has unfolded and ended, there's a very brief sentence in there where you talk about Spotted Hawk using the lip to what non-natives would do is pointing. What I noticed the difference between here, this book, and there was this seemed to be written more towards the Native community than there. Was that your intention? And because there are things in here that only Native people who have lived in this world are going to pick up on. Do you think that helps bring more Native people into reading this work, but doesn't it also alienate the non-Native audience?
I think with the second book, I felt like I was allowed more. So the second book is maybe more boring. I'll just tell you now, in case you're thinking about buying it. You know, you can't compare with the first one. It's like they're going to rob the powwow. That's not what this book is. But it really gets into the intimate lives of real Native people and what the Native experience is like. And I think I was allowed to be more interior and more ruminative and a little bit more insider into what that could look like to be a Native person. You know, I've never gotten pushback from the editors being like pander to anybody or like you need to clarify what you're signaling here because it feels like you're doing insider stuff that the general reader is going to be frustrated by. I never got any of that, and I feel grateful for that. I feel like by doing this historical stuff, it allows, I think, a lot of us as Native people to extend ourselves into the lives of the people that we've been taught. A lot of us, the values that we've been taught are like, we're here because of all these people who did all this. That's not necessarily a value that's built into the American value system. And so I think just the context is so much different. And so I was able to do things that they're there, just the form itself was informing a lot.
I got mad at you while I was reading this book. I think I told you this over dinner, is this book flew across my room several times while reading it, particularly because of Richard Henry Pratt. Not a name that you hear in most Native households give with any respect or veneration. It's a four-letter word as far as I'm concerned. You took an individual who is the epitome of the assimilation movement for most families. Coming from a family where my grandmother and great-grandmother and all of their relatives were taken from their homes in Northern California and placed in boarding schools in Chemawa, Oregon, and in Riverside, California, it's hard to think of Pratt as a human. It's hard not to see him as a monster, but you humanized him. And that's something I've struggled with. So I'm curious, why did you think he needed to be humanized? And was it in your, I guess I'm just going to just ask, do you think that, why did you do it?
So it started as just research. I'm just researching the hell out of the Carlisle School. Particularly what caught my interest was the Fort Marion prison castle. This book was not going to be historical at all. It was a straightforward sequel that kind of started off with the scene in the hospital that I just read. There was like some weird scene in the Coliseum with just the birds. I don't know why. Obviously nobody liked that who was helping me put the book together. And I was in Sweden for the translation of There, and was invited to a museum because they had Southern Cheyenne stuff. And they're like, do you want to see it? We know we're not supposed to have it, but
Yeah.
we have it. You want to see it? And I saw this newspaper clipping, and this is what I went down this rabbit hole because I was like, oh, Southern Cheyennes in Florida in 1875. Like, that doesn't fit our timeline. Nobody wants to be in Florida if they don't have to be. And found out that they took a bunch of us on a train from Oklahoma to Florida, and that was the blueprint for the Carlisle School. So finding out that information, I just got really hungry to find out, like, how did we go from prison castle, adult prisoners of war to the children, and then obviously at the heart of that is somebody that campaigned to make it a reality. So obviously an actual villain. But the more research I did, the more I realized he was less bad than a lot of the American men around him and the people in power, like Teddy Roosevelt. In terms of Native people, were worse. They thought of Native people as deserving extermination. He said if they would allow Native people into public schools, he would dismantle the boarding schools immediately. So I don't like him. I don't think he was good. Yeah. I started writing him in a more human way and just writing him into the book because he's a central figure to this piece of history and because I realized there were so many worse American men around him that were doing worse things. So I think just having him be a character and doing fiction the way that I know how to do it, it created a human dimension. I certainly didn't want to make the reader sympathetic to his plight or whatever. I was just trying to render him as somebody that felt real.
There's a point where Pratt makes a trip to San Francisco and meets his grandson, gets to hold his grandson. And that is almost a redeeming quality for an individual who prevented that from happening for hundreds and thousands of men and women who, one, never grew up knowing their families, as you know, who then returned to their communities not knowing anything other than matrons and teachers who didn't grow up with someone holding them, didn't grow up with someone telling them I love you, didn't grow up with someone teaching them how to be a parent, which has now translated into what is called by the general population dysfunctional families within the Native community. I found reading that passage then the work of Opal to get and ensure that Orville went through therapy. Those are pulling at each other. They're showing that connection. So how do we reconcile that? How do we say, yes, we have this person who was not the greatest, but not the worst, who did all of this, but yet is able to have that family that he denied so many others?
Well, I guess to be fair to me, is how you, what I should
Sure,
start
we can
this
be fair to you.
sentence.
It's your show.
He's a miserable person, and he's miserable holding the baby, and the baby's named after him, and like there's several people that are named after him in the family. This is like the third Richard Henry Pratt, and he's miserable and he feels sick holding the baby, and he falls asleep and dies shortly after, and like maybe through some encounter with Charles Starr, some weird counter with Charles Starr's body. He dies mysteriously shortly after that. So I did kill him in a way that's not explicit in history. He does end up in San Francisco at the end of his life. There's nobody knows why. His son did live there, and he died in a military hospital, all white walls, staring at the wall, faced away from one of his children, saying there was no better plan. So there's something really horrible, and that's your last words. So he had an investment. He was mistaken. He was deeply flawed in his thinking. But there was something compelling for me about fictionally representing a man who thought there was no better plan to his dying day than to do this irreparable, horrible damage to countless Native families.
But without him as a part of history, we don't get the story. So he's extremely integral to that whole component. I understand that. I will continue to struggle with his humanization for a while, just
Fair.
knowing how it translated out. There is a quote in your book, and I keep coming back to it, and it's on page 189, and it says, it's about Oakland. It says, Oakland is always trying to be better. Even if it doesn't get there, and people are always messing with it, but it never stops trying. And I found that I kept coming back to that passage because I started replacing Oakland with Indians. Because that seems to be the cycle. We try to go forward, people mess with what is trying to happen, we return to trying, and we keep going through. How do you see that cycle, not only in the work you're doing and all of this, but how do you see that playing out?
I mean, it's in a way a certain kind of existential stubbornness is the way we've been able to survive all that we've been able to survive. This continually trying amidst really harsh realities. It's true of Oakland too. And there's a lot of people who have been displaced from Oakland and can no longer call Oakland their home, and a lot of tech money that's done a lot of damage. But for Native people, the mismanagement of us as a people by a government who just kept replacing actively violent genocidal tactics with quiet, colder, but still genocidal tactics. It just feels like the campaign continues. We are still doing things to resist and to better ourselves, but the level of dysfunction that's been sown into our families, as you mentioned earlier, there's a lot to unpack. And I was talking to my friend Therese Mayat recently, and she was talking about like the day-to-day dysfunction of our families is a very real struggle in trying to like be excellent as Native professionals and teachers and artists. There's a lot that we're up against, but the continual trying aspect and the striving to not only just keep existing and not only just surviving, but like lift everything that's good about us up is how we've been surviving for way longer than probably statistically we should have if you were to like chart it out in some kind of AI program. Like we shouldn't still be here.
That was the goal. We're not supposed to be here. For every one of us that's here, that means someone died. For us to be alive today, someone had to die for us to be here. And I think that's a burden that we all carry. And it's very difficult. But that burden shows up in these characters. And I do struggle with them as characters because they represent so many people that I know, and I know you know, that these could be anyone that we sit down and have coffee with. But all of them are searching for something. They're struggling internally with their place in this world and with who they are. And you tackle one of the bigger issues that Native people are facing, the DNA testing. the ability of someone to take and put spit in a jar and send it off to a lab and all of a sudden you're Indian, you have X number percentage, but they know nothing about who they are or where they belong, what tribe they belong to. That identity crisis that we face as Native people, on one hand, of trying to fit into American society with all the stereotypes, with the untold history, plus this new avenue of using science to create another group of us. How do we reconcile that? How did you go through that process of getting that into here and really deciding that that was something you wanted to tackle?
Really hard-hitting questions. It's sort of a joke to a lot of Native people, like the idea that you could actually be Native based on the test, because we know so much of it has to do with who do you know? How are we connected? There's like 2 degrees of separation between so many of us. And at the same time, like there's people who grew up with white parents and are part of, deeply problematic ways that we've been treated along the way, in systems that we haven't been able to find our ways out of. And so identity for us is so fraught with so many different things. And I thought, the character who has the DNA test, he's not really trying to be like, I'm hardcore going to be Native now. He just has questions. Yeah. And I just, I wanted to represent this spectrum of like all the ways that Americans and Native people think about identity and belonging. And for Native people, it's a really complex thing, like this blood quantum thing, and tribal membership and enrollment, and having kids really complicates it, and teaching them about belonging and how much can they actually, if their parent is not Native and they become mixed, it's all very messy. Like my son, just give an example of how messy this blood quantum thing is. So my dad's basically full blood. But his dad's dad did not accept him as a son because he was the product of an extramarital affair. So on his birth certificate, there's no father. And so on his blood quantum, we have official government numbers that represent how much blood that we have. There's like a blood record that everyone has. My number is 9014, like with a bunch of things in front of it. But those are the 4 numbers when I call the office of enrollment that I have to remember to tell them to make sure.
4847.
So that made my dad half nothing and half Cheyenne, which made me a quarter blood quantum wise, even though everyone knows who his dad is, and he looks just like him. So my son, based on our blood quantum laws, could not enroll because his mom was not Native, not Cheyenne. Even if she was Native, if she wasn't Cheyenne, it wouldn't have worked out. So he spent the first 10, 11 years of his life knowing he can't enroll in the tribe. And that does something to you. My tribe recently lowered the blood quantum requirement to an 8th, which is what he technically is. So he's enrolled now, and so is my other son. But that game can't keep going on, and it's been sort of a losing. It's meant to be a destructive technique that we've sort of taken on. Longer answer than what you asked.
No, actually, I think you've answered it perfectly, and I think you've led to the last question I have, because I know the audience has questions for you, though I'd like to exclude them and we can just talk. I'm selfish that way. Towards the end, they're driving in the car. There's the 2 kids sitting in the back, and Louise Erdrich's audiobook, Roundhouse, is playing. It is probably single-handedly one of the best fiction books that handles federal Indian law, that explains the deep complexity that many of us spend years studying. I took that as more than just a shout out, because the kids are sitting in the back, they're doing their thing, and their ears are perking up at certain points. moving from the identity piece where we struggle with this as individuals, our children, nieces and nephews, to that moment of that transmission of knowledge of the very thing, the very laws that are on the books of the United States today in the court cases that rule our lives, basically. That was intentional, I'm going to assume. And how does that play out for you and for your kids and transmitting that knowledge on?
I mean, it was a shout out that was layered in this idea of the transmission of knowledge. And Louise Erdrich, to me, what she did in that book, like you said, like, it's never trying to teach you something. It's totally an amazing story that you're wrapped up in. And to be able to synthesize this important information that anybody could read about, but usually it's really boring and tedious. So to synthesize with fiction, the shout out was like, this is how we do it. And stories was how we did it before. Complex aspects of what existence means. Stories were always meant to do that, to help us understand what life is better and to then live better in it, with it. So the shout out was like this layered thing that I've gotten so much from Louise Erdrich as a writer, but as a Native person also. But I don't, as far as what I'm going to do or what to do with the stuff that she's talking about in Indian law is a little bit beyond me. Like, I'm not very good at a lot of things in life. I've realized I can do this, and some of those more complex aspects of teaching my children what it means. There's a hard road ahead, but I think someplace like the Bay Area, where we're super diverse and building language together to be inclusive of what it means to be a human and all the different nations we have behind us, I'm hopeful in a place like this to live here and to build better language together. And that goes for Native people, but a lot of people of color and just people that have all these different cultures coming together at once.
Thank you. We're going to open it up to the audience. I think we've got a microphone that's going around.
Thank you.
Oh, testing? Okay. I was wondering if you could expand a little bit on the concept of hunger that you were describing feeling during the writing of this book, and whether or not you feel like that's been satisfied, or if it's still kind of laying within you.
Yeah, I think it's still very real. I think to a lot of Native people, like we got 2 Native shows basically that got enough traction and attention that we could call them like these are real Native shows. Reservation Dogs, Rutherford Falls. Let's not get into a debate about Dark Winds and Tony Hillerman and the legacy of white people writing about us. I know that Dark Winds has a full Native cast, and they brought in a Native writer's room, and that's why I don't want to get into it. But for the 2 shows we had, I felt like it felt like something was starting, and now it feels like it was an anomaly. I hope that's not the case, but that was 2021. I believe in 1911 or it might have been 1921 or 1924, somewhere around there. Jim Thorpe and a whole group of people got together to talk about the negative depiction and false depiction of Native people in film that early on. And we didn't have a TV show made about us and what it's really like to be like us, that's like with a Native writer's room and people in front of the camera, behind the camera, until 2021. And one of the shows got canceled after 2 seasons, and the other show decided to stop to go on and do other things. So there's a lot still. There's one of the first and only books about Native people living in cities, but we've been living in cities for over 20 years, 80% of us. And there's not any other books that I'm seeing get a lot of attention in the publishing world. So like correct depiction of us as we are I think is still lacking. And I think there's something deeply uncomfortable Americans have not dealt with in the American narrative about the foundation of the country that they're not wanting to deal with. So I think until, obviously, we just voted in the worst person, like, to be moving forward in some good direction around the American narrative and what it means to be an American and what it's meant. But until we reckon with the way Native people fit into the American story, I don't have that much hope for there being studios or industry people in any industry that are willing to take us seriously. That's really sad and depressing to say, and I didn't mean to say it. It just started coming. In response to the hunger question, like us wanting to be seen, like we're the same amount of people as Jewish people in the United States, and there's plenty of narrative there in the American imagination that we've seen. That's because America saved them from the Nazis. That's a really easy story to tell and still, perpetuate the American narrative in a way that works. There's not that for Native people. And I think that's just my own theory on why it's not working.
Hi, it's so amazing to see you again. I wanted to congratulate you on being selected as the future library author.
Thank you.
And I was just curious, and I know you can't talk about what you're writing about, but what the experience of writing a book that won't be read for another 90-some years, what that's like for you.
The hardest part is, like, if I write something really good, not lying and just selling it and being like, that's a book I can't talk about, and then we're all dead by the time anyone reads it, and they'll be like, oh, he tricked us, and whatever. I'm gonna put like my blood, sweat, and tears into a full book and then just put it away. Yeah. That feels hard to deal with, so there's like a level of like, how do I deal with that? Time is, it's a resource. And I want to honor what's being asked of me, and I want to conjure enough hope in myself to believe in the people in 2114. If there's a habitable world to live in, then they probably went through a lot. So I want to try to honor that, but it's tricky. I'm serious. Like, if I write something that I think is really good, do I want to just be like, lock it up, but I made a copy, and this isn't the same one as that. Don't tell anyone. Well, I'll be dead, so. This is not a confession that that's what I'm doing. It's just, that's the way my mind works.
Also, it's also a lot of pressure because, you only have a year to do it.
Yeah. Now, it's like 6 months.
Next question. Right here.
It was really nice to hear you talk about the humanizing aspect and representation and presentation and how that's different and all that matters. I wanted to ask, why did you pick that specific passage or excerpt from your novel when you were reading? Like, is there a personal association with it, or did you just like what you wrote?
I think I've just learned from, as I said before, like, people don't usually want to hear me read. It's like gone out of style or something for some people in the book world to have the author read. But when I have read that particular section, it has enough sort of energy to it that I can feel the audience engaging with it from experience. The last thing I want to do is read something that's too heavy or boring. And reading something that everyone does at their own pace, and each book has its own timing for anyone, and so I just felt that's representative of sort of the tone of the book, and it has played well in the past. mostly I didn't want to bore people, and I know that passage has enough energy to it to not have that happen.
Is there another question? Right here.
Thank you for being here. Thank you for your work. I wanted to ask a question about storytelling. You talk about it in the beginning of Wandering Stars about how stories are not just there to comfort. What they do is they take us elsewhere and they bring us back better. I love that. I love that idea, and I just wanted to hear you say more about it. Thank you.
Yeah, I think I've always been writing sort of as if to save my own life, like with an urgency. Like the place that it comes from is like I'm trying to help what feels like an emergency. And I feel like there's a lot out there that's entertainment, and there's nothing wrong with that. But coming from, like the Native experience and the ways that we can use story to help us, the function of story is different than like escapism and like I'm bored because I have too much leisure time. Fill my time with like a fantasy thing. That's not where a lot of it comes from for Native people. If they're putting their time in to listen to a story, it better be doing something to help. And so that's where my urgency comes from as a writer, and that's what I want stories to do for me. So that's sort of where that came from.
In the back over here.
Well, thanks for being here, number one. And I'm just curious. I loved reading There. I have yet to read Stars. But in your writing, you juxtapose indigeneity to whiteness and perhaps exploring identity and what whiteness has wrought upon it. I'm just curious if part of your thinking about stepping into more writing will kind of dive into this acronym BIPOC, P-I-P-O-C, and the ties and intersections that bring people of African descent and indigenous descent together, those two types of indigeneities. If that's even part of your lived experience, because I can only imagine that a lot of your lived experience steps into your writing as well.
I mean, right now, if a story spoke to me that had characters in it that come from that background, I would certainly want to write into it because there's so many important connections between Black people in this country and Native people in this country, and so many commonalities in ways that it's important to unify around and to listen to each other's stories about. But I don't have anything I'm not against it. I wouldn't not do it. Right now I'm working on, my third book is sort of this idea of pretendians. I'm not going to tell you what the plot is right now, even though I almost did. And I did earlier to the students, but sometimes if I talk about it, it does something weird to me. So that, I'm sort of focusing on what I'm writing right now. I'm finishing a novel and I'm finishing a feature film screenplay with a studio. So that's what I'm working on. It doesn't happen to include what you brought up, but I'd be very open if a story spoke to me and had characters in it that could tell that story, for sure.
There was a question over here.
Hey, I was just curious, I know you talked in the earlier discussion about kind of your research process while you're writing, but I'm wondering if there are any other genres or mediums that sustain you when you're writing, maybe not necessarily because they contribute to the project you're working on, but because they help you balance sort of your moments of rest, or is there anything that really kind of fuels you or that you tend to go to when you're trying to find that balance between high productivity as writing and also all the other things that your sort of body and mind need?
Yeah, I mean, I have a 2-year-old who's been very high needs for the past 2 years. So like the idea of like doing anything else, I like sneak in writing wherever I can. But right now I've had some time open up to me, and I love watching shows, TV shows, and movies. One of my favorite things to do is to go to the movie theater by myself and watch a movie. So those things fuel me for sure. I try to find things that are related to what I'm working on, because then I can sort of tell myself I'm working. But you know, I'm also just, I can be all about like something that I just enjoy. I listen to comedy podcasts, and I listen to music, and I play music, and those are all things that fuel me for sure. I run, you know, I've been running for a long time, and that's something that fuels me too. That's not really a media, but.
Are there other questions? Thank you.
Thank you.
You're done? Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all for joining us. We have pre-signed books, as I said over here, available for purchase. Dan, can you show us the last slide real quick? Just wanted to make one more announcement. Okay, if you like our work and what we do, please go ahead and take a little Q&R shot and fill out the survey. It helps us present quality presentations like this one. Okay, and join us again on February 20th for Carvel Wallace. Thanks, guys. Good night.